Every movie review of Saving Private Ryan has stressed it. The first half hour of the film is a graphic and ghastly recreation of the D-Day assault on Omaha Beach.
Saving Private Ryan made grown men cry, changed the war genre for good, and cemented Tom Hanks as Hollywood's ultimate everyman hero. But here's the thing. There's something most people completely missed. And now, after years of keeping quiet, Tom Hanks is finally pulling back the curtain. Think you know everything there is to know about Saving Private Ryan? Think again, because Hanks just dropped a quiet little truth bomb that has fans and film geeks all over the internet doing double takes. Stick around till the end to find out. Ready? Let's get into it. Casting choices that changed everything. When Steven Spielberg sat down to cast Saving Private Ryan, he knew from the very beginning that he didn't want to make just another war movie. He wanted something that felt real, not polished, not heroic in the traditional sense, but something raw, intimate, and brutally honest. And that meant starting with the cast. His choices would shape not just the tone of the film, but also its emotional impact. So, instead of chasing after Hollywood's typical action stars, Spielberg did something many wouldn't have dared. He deliberately sought out actors who didn't look like the standard war movie tough guys. He didn't want a square-jawed, invincible John Wayne type leading the charge. Instead, he wanted someone who could carry a kind of emotional gravity, someone whose face looked like it had seen things, hard things. That's where Tom Hanks came in. Now, why Hanks? Why not someone flashier or more physically commanding? Spielberg reportedly said that he picked Hanks because he was the only actor he could imagine who wouldn't try to yank a grenade pin out with his teeth. That single comment, odd as it may sound, actually speaks volumes. It showed how committed Spielberg was to realism. He didn't want cool stunts or macho moments. He wanted the horror and confusion of war to feel as unsettling to the audience as it must have been to those soldiers. Hanks fit that vision perfectly. You thought you knew everything about Saving Private Ryan? Well, think again. Tom Hanks just dropped a behind-the-scenes truth that completely changes how we see one of the most powerful war movies ever made. What was hidden in plain sight? And why did he wait this long to talk about it? Stick around, because once you hear what he revealed, you'll never watch that film the same way again. His portrayal of Captain Miller was not about bravado. It was about quiet courage and emotional restraint. Spielberg said he needed an adult in the story, someone the younger men would instinctively follow. And Hanks, with that signature blend of steadiness and soul, brought that to life. But even then, they made sure to layer in vulnerability. That uncontrollable tremble in Miller's hand, it wasn't just a physical tic. It was a sign that even the calmest man can be undone by war. And yet, believe it or not, Hanks wasn't the only name on the table. Before he was cast, Spielberg seriously considered Mel Gibson and Harrison Ford, two major stars with action-packed resumes. But in the end, he went with the man who didn't feel like a superhero. Maybe because in a film about sacrifice and humanity, it was more important for the lead to feel real than heroic. Then came the role of Private Ryan himself. Spielberg had something very specific in mind. He didn't want a household name. In fact, he preferred someone relatively unknown. Someone who just had that pure, everyday American look. A kid who could be your neighbor or your younger brother. Matt Damon had auditioned but didn't get the part initially. So how did he end up in one of the most iconic war films of all time? Well, as fate would have it, it all came down to a casual, almost accidental introduction. set up by none other than Robin Williams. Damon later shared that Robin took him and Ben Affleck to meet Spielberg, not with any job in mind, but just because, in his words, it's never a bad thing to meet the greatest filmmaker of all time. During that meeting, Spielberg immediately recognized Damon from his role in Courage Under Fire. But something didn't quite click. Spielberg thought Damon looked far too thin to play the wholesome, strong Ryan he had in mind. What he didn't know was that Damon had dropped around 40 pounds for his previous role, playing a harmful substance addict. So naturally, he looked a bit gaunt. But once Spielberg saw Damon back at his usual weight, everything changed. Suddenly, Damon was exactly what he had been looking for all along: young, sincere, and relatable. It's kind of wild to think that one actor's body transformation nearly cost him a role that would change his career. Now, if you thought those casting stories were interesting, wait till you hear about Vin Diesel. His path to the film was anything but typical. At the time, Diesel wasn't a name anyone in Hollywood was buzzing about. In fact, he was working as a telemarketer and hustling hard to get noticed. And how did he catch Spielberg's attention? Not through an agent or some inside connection, but through his own indie film work. Spielberg had seen Multifacial, a short film Diesel wrote, directed, and starred in, and he was impressed. He also saw Diesel's feature film Strays, and clearly something about the guy stuck with him. Imagine that. One of the biggest directors in the world watching a struggling actor's low-budget film and saying, "I want him in my movie." It almost sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But Diesel didn't just show up on set and follow directions. He brought ideas. During one scene with his character, Private Capasso, Diesel suggested to Spielberg that they place a second camera in a nearby window to capture an alternate angle. Spielberg didn't just brush him off, he actually went with it. That shot? It turned out to be so good that it ended up in the movie's trailer. Diesel later called his casting the most bizarre form of recruitment I've ever experienced. And honestly, who could blame him? How often does a guy go from cold calling strangers for a living to getting directed by Spielberg because of a self-funded indie project? Isn't it amazing how the right casting can turn a good script into something deeply human? Spielberg understood that better than most, and by choosing actors who felt real, grounded, and emotionally open, he gave us a film that still resonates with audiences decades later. Secrets behind the most iconic scenes. When people talk about Saving Private Ryan, they often mention the powerful acting, the unforgettable opening scene, or Tom Hanks's deeply human performance. But what many might not fully grasp is just how much of a technical and cinematic revolution the film was, especially when it came to how war was portrayed on screen. The movie didn't just tug at emotions, it rattled the senses, and for good reason. Behind every gut-wrenching frame was a masterclass in filmmaking led by Steven Spielberg, who wasn't just trying to make a movie, he was trying to replicate history itself. So, what exactly did it take to bring that level of realism to the big screen? Let's start with the now iconic Omaha Beach scene, the one that leaves viewers clutching their seats within the first few minutes. That chaotic, blood-soaked, nerve-rattling 24-minute sequence alone cost a jaw-dropping $12 million to shoot. Think about that for a second. Nearly a fifth of the film's entire $70 million budget was poured into just the opening minutes. Why so much? Well, Spielberg and his crew didn't just stage the D-Day landing, they practically recreated it. For 4 whole weeks, the team filmed on Curracloe Beach in Ireland, which they had painstakingly transformed into a stand-in for Omaha Beach in Normandy. We're talking full-on battlements, service roads, bunkers, you name it. Every square inch of that shoreline was sculpted and styled to match historical records. Now, did they use CGI to cut corners? Not even close. In fact, Spielberg deliberately steered away from digital shortcuts. Instead, he brought in over 1,000 extras from the Irish Army Reserves to act as soldiers. On top of that, they included 20 to 30 amputee actors for hauntingly realistic injury effects. And if that wasn't enough, they threw in another 1,000 incredibly lifelike dummies to fill in the chaos. Real explosives were used instead of digital ones, yes, actual controlled detonations, because Spielberg believed that the authenticity of real debris, fire, and sand flying through the air would resonate more deeply with audiences. Can you blame him? The level of detail was astonishing. Costume designer Joanna Johnston handcrafted every uniform down to the stitching to mirror what soldiers actually wore in 1944. The Czech hedgehogs, those gnarly metal anti-tank obstacles scattered along the beach, were positioned with near-obsessive accuracy. Nothing was left to chance. Every prop, every bullet casing, every blood-spattered helmet was part of a larger vision to immerse the viewer into the horror and heroism of war. But Spielberg didn't stop at physical details. The visual style of the film was another stroke of genius. Rather than storyboard the Omaha Beach sequence like most directors would, Spielberg tossed the storyboard out the window. Why? Because he wanted the filming to feel unpredictable, just like real combat. He instructed his crew to make it feel raw, immediate, like you'd just picked up a World War II soldier's camera and hit record. At one point, he even attached a Black & Decker drill to a Panaflex camera to mimic the jarring motion of old battlefield footage. Eventually, they found something called an image shaker lens that created that same rattling effect without the need for power tools and a 90-yard extension cord. But still, how wild is it that he even tried that in the first place? And the visual tricks didn't stop there. Spielberg and cinematographer Janusz Kaminski used old lenses with stripped coatings to give the footage a hazy, vintage 1940s look. They adjusted the camera shutter to 45 degrees, unconventional, to say the least, to make the sand particles and debris appear sharper, more violent. They even mismatched lenses across cameras to give scenes an off-kilter, jarring visual mood, reinforcing the emotional disorientation of war. Now, wouldn't most directors just use a filter or two and call it a day? As if that wasn't ambitious enough, Spielberg made the unusual choice to shoot the majority of the film in chronological order. That might not sound like a big deal, but in the world of filmmaking, it's incredibly rare. Why? Because it's expensive, time-consuming, and logistically challenging. But Spielberg believed that this approach would help the actors stay immersed in their characters' emotional journeys. And he wasn't wrong. Shooting in sequence meant that the actors, including Tom Hanks and the rest of the squad, experienced the story as their characters would, from the adrenaline and terror of storming the beach to the fatigue, grief, and trauma that unfolded in later scenes. Spielberg later admitted that this method created a mentally demoralizing experience for the cast. But maybe that was the point. Isn't war itself emotionally exhausting? Isn't that what they were trying to portray? So, while Saving Private Ryan may have wowed audiences with its gripping story and brilliant performances, the true magic happened behind the camera, through months of planning, bold creative choices, and an uncompromising dedication to authenticity. What Tom Hanks quietly did behind the scenes might just change the way you watch this movie forever. So sit tight, because this next part will surprise you in ways you didn't see coming. Tom Hanks hidden contributions to the film. When people talk about the brilliance of Saving Private Ryan, they often highlight its raw combat realism, Spielberg's direction, or the emotional weight it carries from start to finish. But behind the battlefields and bloodshed, there's an often overlooked layer of the film's power, one shaped quietly and masterfully by none other than Tom Hanks. While most fans recognize his gripping portrayal of Captain John Miller, few realize just how much creative influence he had on what actually made it into the final cut. And here's the kicker. Much of what makes the film feel so honest, so heartbreakingly human, can be traced back to Hanks's subtle but meaningful behind-the-scenes input. Isn't it fascinating how someone can impact a project not just with their performance, but with their instincts, their restraint, and their deep understanding of people? Take, for example, that unforgettable scene where Captain Miller finally opens up to his men about who he was before the war, a simple school teacher back home. It's one of the film's most tender and vulnerable moments. But would you believe that it was originally written as a much longer monologue? That's right, Spielberg and screenwriter Robert Rodat had envisioned a version where Miller really lays it all out, delving deep into his backstory. But Hanks, ever the storyteller with a pulse on human behavior, raised a gentle objection. He reportedly explained in an interview that he didn't believe a man like Miller, who had kept his identity so close to the chest all this time, would suddenly start spilling his life story. According to him, the more honest version of the scene would come from a place of quiet disclosure, not dramatic speech-making. So he pushed for a shorter version, and in hindsight, wasn't that a stroke of genius? The trimmed-down version hit even harder, precisely because it felt true. A man who had kept his guard up for so long finally lets it slip, just a little. And in that restraint, we feel everything. But Hanks's influence didn't stop there. Ever notice that incredibly touching moment when Private Ryan, played by Matt Damon, shares a memory about his brothers back home? That slightly awkward, slightly funny, but deeply real story about spying on one of them in a barn with a girl. Turns out, that scene wasn't even in the original script. It was born from a conversation between Hanks and Damon. Drawing from his own experience behind the camera, Hanks encouraged Damon to think up a personal, spontaneous anecdote that would humanize Ryan, not just as the soldier they had to save, but as a brother, a son, a person. Something that would make the audience see him not as a mission objective, but as someone worth saving. And Damon delivered. After bouncing ideas around with Hanks, he came up with that barn story, one that made it all the way into the final film. The moment was gentle, almost unassuming, but it gave Ryan a dimension that wasn't there before. Now, ask yourself, without that scene, would you have felt quite so protective of him? And then there was the last day of shooting the church scene. You'd think, by then, everyone would be exhausted, maybe even relieved to be done. But Hanks, ever the heart of the crew, saw that day differently. Standing behind the church they had used to film some of the film's most emotional sequences, he took it upon himself to gather the cast and offer a simple, spontaneous toast. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It was just Hanks speaking from the heart. And what did he say? Something that stuck with those who heard it. He reportedly told them, "What we've made here will outlast us all." And isn't that just something? That one quiet moment of reflection, shared among people who had just spent weeks reliving a brutal piece of history, captured the weight of what they'd done. It wasn't just a movie. It was a tribute, a responsibility, a legacy. And Hanks understood that, not just as an actor, but as a human being who knew the power of stories and the weight they can carry. So, While most fans walk away from Saving Private Ryan in awe of its spectacle and emotion, many never realize how much of that came from Hanks's touch, his restraint, his suggestions, his questions. What if he hadn't suggested trimming that speech? What if he hadn't nudged Damon to share a real feeling memory? What if he hadn't paused filming to acknowledge what they'd all just done together? The film might still have been good, but would it have resonated the same way? Maybe not. And that's the quiet power of Tom Hanks, shaping the soul of a film not just by standing in front of the camera, but by listening, feeling, and leading from behind it. But here's the thing. What if I told you there's a part of his role in Saving Private Ryan that most fans completely missed? So stay with me, because what comes next might just change how you see the entire film. Forever. What most fans never figured out about Saving Private Ryan. When people talk about Saving Private Ryan, most immediately think of the opening D-Day sequence, the chaotic storming of Omaha Beach, the deafening blasts, the sand stained with history. But buried deep beneath all the explosions and gunfire, hidden behind the intensity of Tom Hanks's performance and the raw emotion on screen, lies a story rooted in reality that most viewers never truly recognize. It's easy to assume that the film's central idea, rescuing a lone surviving brother during wartime, was just an emotional Hollywood invention, or perhaps loosely based on the well-known tragedy of the Sullivan brothers. After all, isn't that the story we've all heard? 5 brothers on the same ship, all tragically lost at sea. But surprisingly, that's not where the real story begins. In fact, the heart of Saving Private Ryan was inspired by a lesser-known family, the Neland Brothers from Tonawanda, New York. Now here's where things get especially interesting. How many people actually know about them? Probably not many. And that's what makes their story all the more haunting and powerful. Frederick Fritz, Robert, Preston, and Edward Neland were 4 brothers who, like so many young men during World War II, answered the call to serve. But unlike the Sullivan brothers, they weren't all placed in the same unit. Why? Because the U.S. military, learning from past tragedies, had started a policy of assigning siblings to different divisions to reduce the risk of entire families being wiped out in one battle. It was a strategy rooted in compassion, but unfortunately, war rarely plays by the rules of kindness. When D-Day came crashing down on the shores of France, the Neland brothers were scattered across different corners of the conflict. Robert was serving with the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment when he was killed during the Normandy invasion. Just 1 day later, Preston landed on Utah Beach, and he too was killed in action. Can you imagine the kind of letter their parents received back home? One son gone, then another within the space of just 24 hours. And if that wasn't devastating enough, the military soon received word that Edward, who served as an Air Force pilot, had gone missing after his bomber crashed in Burma. By mid-1944, the Neland family believed they had lost 3 of their 4 sons. The weight of that sorrow is almost too heavy to imagine, isn't it? That's when the U.S. Army stepped in. The sole survivor policy, which was later formalized, was already being quietly observed, and the idea of pulling a soldier out of combat to spare a family from losing every son began to take shape. Enter Father Francis Sampson, a Catholic chaplain with the 501st Regiment. Upon learning about the Neland family's situation, he took it upon himself to locate Fritz, still serving in France, and arrange for his return home. One can only picture the emotional burden that Fritz must have carried as he made that trip back to the United States. He left behind the war, yes, but he also left behind his brothers, 2 confirmed dead. and one lost without a trace. And yet, as life often proves, there are moments when hope quietly defies despair. Months later, the unimaginable happened. Edward, the missing airman, was discovered alive. He hadn't perished in that bomber crash after all. Instead, he had been captured and held in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Against all odds, he had survived. So while Saving Private Ryan ends with one brother coming home as the last surviving son, the Neland story had a slightly different outcome. Edward returned too. 2 sons came back, and 2 did not. A heartbreaking balance of loss and relief that doesn't fit neatly into a screenplay, but adds a whole new depth to the film's emotional core. So what does all this mean for viewers? It means that Saving Private Ryan wasn't just a brilliant piece of cinema, it was a window into a real family's suffering, resilience, and love. It also reminds us that behind every name etched into a war memorial, there's a family who lived with the absence, who counted the empty chairs at the dinner table. Spielberg and screenwriter Robert Rodat didn't just pull a story from thin air. They reached into the annals of history and pulled out a thread that still has the power to stir souls. And yet, how many people actually leave the theater or turn off their TV knowing this? How many understand that this wasn't just fiction cleverly designed to win awards, that it was, at its very core, a reflection of true events, rooted in heartbreak and heroism? Maybe it's time more of us did. Because the Neland Brothers deserve to be remembered, not just as the inspiration behind a powerful film, but as real men caught in the storm of a war that reshaped the world. Their story, quiet and tucked away in the corners of history, deserves to be told again and again. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most important part of Saving Private Ryan that so many people never realized. Why Spielberg initially avoided showing German artillery. When Steven Spielberg first began shaping the concept for what would eventually become Saving Private Ryan, his initial vision was quite different from the raw, harrowing film that audiences ultimately saw on the big screen. According to Spielberg, he had originally leaned toward making the film resemble a boy's own style adventure. You know, the kind of glossy, almost light-hearted tale of wartime camaraderie and noble heroics that used to define war movies in the mid-20th century. At the heart of that early concept was the idea of focusing the story on a public relations effort during the war, which, at first glance, seemed like a neat cinematic angle. But something didn't sit right with him. As he dove deeper into research and started having real conversations with actual World War II veterans, men who had lived through unimaginable chaos and loss, Spielberg came to a sobering realization. Was it really appropriate to romanticize something that had scarred so many lives? Could he, in good conscience, glamorize a war that left entire nations shattered? What he really wanted to do was to give viewers a visceral experience, one that made them feel the panic, the confusion, and the absolute terror that soldiers felt in the thick of battle. His new goal? To strip away the polish and present war in its most brutally honest form, chaotic, unfiltered, and personal. He said he aimed to show palpable terror, almost blind terror, by zooming in on the men who fought, not the faceless enemies they battled against. It wasn't about strategy or politics anymore. It was about humanity, fear, and sacrifice. This vision didn't just shape the story or performances, it had a massive impact on how the film actually looked and felt. Enter cinematographer Janusz Kaminski, Spielberg's longtime collaborator and the man responsible for the movie's gritty, haunting visual style. Kaminski knew that if they were going to make viewers feel like they had been dropped onto Omaha Beach, The film had to look nothing like the clean, colorful war movies of old. He needed it to resemble the kind of grainy, shaky footage that combat cameramen might have captured during the real D-Day landings. But how do you make a Hollywood production look like 1940s battlefield footage? Well, Kaminsky got creative. One of the first things he did was remove the protective coating from the camera lenses. That might sound a bit reckless, right? But it was intentional. Doing so helped to degrade the image slightly, flattening it out and giving it that imperfect, aged quality that mimicked the look of older military equipment. Then, just to keep things visually unpredictable, he mismatched lenses between the multiple cameras they were using. That meant that no two shots looked quite the same. Some would come out more distorted, others more crisp. Exactly the kind of inconsistency that you'd expect from wartime footage. But they didn't stop there. When it came to action scenes, especially those explosive, high-stakes moments where everything is chaos, Kaminsky chose to use a 45-degree shutter angle. What does that do? In simple terms, it makes the movement on screen feel sharper and more jittery, capturing the crisp, staccato violence of explosions and gunfire. It gave every movement, every bullet, every stumble an almost hyper-real edge. On top of that, they employed a specialized device called an image shaker, which literally vibrated the camera during takes to simulate the disorientation of nearby blasts. The end result was a film with a bleached, unsteady aesthetic that didn't just look real, it felt real. Every frame seemed to carry the weight of history. The visual language of the film echoed the famous photography of Robert Capa, whose grainy, stark images of the Normandy invasion still haunt history books. Spielberg and Kaminsky weren't just making a war movie. They were rewriting how war could and should be portrayed on screen. And in doing so, they didn't just honor the truth of the battlefield. They changed the entire cinematic vocabulary of the genre. So, what happens when a filmmaker decides to tell the truth instead of selling a myth? What do you get when you strip away the heroism and focus on the heartbreak? In the case of Saving Private Ryan, you get something that doesn't just entertain, it lingers, it teaches, it forces you to feel. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Spielberg wanted all along. Not to show you what war looked like from the outside, but what it felt like on the inside. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.